Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jessica McDonald. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Corvallis, and welcome to the program. For 100 years, the League of Women Voters has been working towards a more perfect democracy. We are proud to be a nonpartisan education and advocacy organization, and we work on issues that are important to you and your family, like voting rights, housing policy, social justice. And tonight's program was born out of our stellar climate change committee. The League is a place where you can have an impact on those issues that matter most to you. So I'm hoping maybe there's some people that aren't League members here and want to get involved. I'd love to see you become a member and join us and get involved. Tonight, you might have noticed that this is a webinar format. You can sit back, relax, have your dinner while you watch the webinar and the panelists. Also, just to note that this meeting is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the League's YouTube channel after this program. Really, the only protocol that you need to know as a Zoom attendee this evening is where to find the Q&A box. So it's typically located at the bottom of your panel as an attendee. When you click on it, you can enter your questions throughout the evening as they come up, and we will have time for those at the Q&A portion at the end of tonight's program. So tonight, our esteemed panelists are exploring the environmental, social, and economic impacts of wildfire in Oregon. Of course, this is a topic that is very close to all of our hearts, as we experienced unprecedented catastrophic wildfire in 2020. From the areas that I grew up along the Mackenzie to the Santiam Canyons, Southern Oregon, east of the Cascades, it seems like not 1 inch of Oregon was spared, with over 1 million acres burned and 11 lives lost. I want to thank the panelists tonight for helping us to understand the far-reaching impacts of these fire disasters. I'm going to pass the microphone over to Nancy Rosenberger, who is your moderator for this evening, also a fellow board member at the League of Women Voters with me. Welcome, panelists, and welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nancy Rosenberger. I'm glad you could come tonight to listen to our panelists' knowledge and their viewpoints on these wildfires that have affected all of us in some way or other during 2020. I represent the Climate Change Action Committee of the Corvallis League. Our mission is to educate the public and develop strong local policies to support climate change mitigation with a focus on climate justice. And we support the National League of Women Voters position, which advocates for action on climate change as a serious threat facing our nation and our planet. So let me introduce the panelists for tonight. Our first panelist will be Dr. Meg Krawchuk, who is an associate professor of forest ecosystems and society in the forestry school at Oregon State University. She got her PhD at the University of Alberta and hails from Canada, I understand, and held a postdoc at the University of California. Dr. Krawchuk focuses on landscape ecology, pyrogeography, which we'll hear more about, fire ecology, as well as conservation, restoration, and sustainable management. She works at local and global scales to address causes and effects of ecological disturbances, such as wildfire. She'll speak tonight on the environmental effects of the wildfires that we've experienced this summer. The second panelist will be Dr. Daniel Lopez-Ceballos. His PhD is from Oregon State University, and he's an associate professor of Latino or Latinx studies in ethnic studies and health equity in the public health school, Oregon State University. He also serves as assistant vice provost for undergraduate education at OSU. Dr. Lopez-Ceballos is an affiliate investigator with the Hispanic Community Health Study and a commissioner appointed by the governor with the Oregon Commission on Hispanic Affairs. His research focuses on the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, class, and other social constructs and how they relate to health and health care. He's invested in the development and implementation of strategies to better serve Latinx and other marginalized communities. He'll speak tonight on the health effects of the wildfires, with particular emphasis on how the lives of Latinx and Hispanic people in Oregon have been affected. The last panelist to speak tonight will be Representative Dan Rayfield. He holds a doctorate in law from Willamette University and represents Oregon State House District 16, which includes a portion of Benton County. He's a co-chair of the Legislative Joint Committee on Ways and Means, so he knows about what's happening financially, and he's a member of the Legislative Joint Emergency Board. He will bring us reflection tonight on the financial and legislative effects of the wildfires at the governmental level. So as we listen to the speakers, don't forget to put in your questions in the question and answers box. We'll start with Dr. Krawchuk.
Thanks, Nancy. I'll get my screen shared here and off to the races. Let me get this tucked up here so I can make that full screen, and we're set to go. All right. So I've been asked to spend about 15 minutes giving us a little bit of environmental context for fire in the Pacific Northwest, but more specifically focusing in on the fires, Labor Day fires that we had this September. And so this for me is thinking about pyrogeography and forest ecosystems, and very much this notion of a balancing act. And I think Daniel's going to really pick up on some of those pieces of balance. There's pros and cons, there's value and grief involved in fire. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce you a little bit to who I am. Nancy's already done a bit of this as a pyrogeographer, and tell you a bit about that word, because I'd like you to maybe try out taking it home with you. I think it's an important and valuable word for us all to be thinking about. Some photos to get us into the groove, remind us where we were, a bit of fire history, some geography, and then thoughts on living with fire to hand off to Daniel moving forward. So as Nancy mentioned, I do a lot of ecology related work, fire ecology and conservation biology, fire analytics, dendroecology, working with tree rings, all sorts of elements that all relate to fire and disturbance. And this word that I really like to use to describe the work that I do is pyrogeography. So what is that thing? What is pyrogeography? It's geography, the study of life, or the study of life, that's biogeography, the study of fire on Earth. And it brings together these really important elements of what we're talking about today in terms of fire. I'm just going to get a pen out here so I can make some annotations. So we're talking about biology and fire, ecology, evolution, how fire has played a role in the development of ecosystems over millions of years on Earth's systems. We're talking about the biophysical environment of fire, the drivers of fire, and biophysical outcomes. And we're also really importantly talking about society and culture and fire, history, politics, sociology, conservation, and management. So really getting to this point that fire is a geography discipline, we have to be thinking about this as a coupled human natural system or social ecological system. And there's a geography to all the pieces of fire that we need to be focused on moving forward. So as an ecologist, I prefer to think of a subset of those circles within the Venn diagram. But I want to start off by getting us into that broad space. The other part of getting us into that broad space is reminding us where we were at for the 2020 fires. So some photos to think about with this underline here that fire is complicated. Oops, we don't want that. So smoke, that was one of the first things we saw in Corvallis, smelt in Corvallis, felt in Corvallis, getting cooler when the big fires played out in the Western Cascades from that big easterly wind event. And so that's one of a very prominent factor, health impacts and ecosystem impacts overall that result from that smoke. There was grief, loss, property loss, hazardous chemicals, changes in water quality. Here's a photo from Blue River at the Holiday Farm fire, as a really impactful photo representing loss of resources and values that we hold dear as people. There were high losses on timber farms, economic losses. More broadly, lots of questions about how forest management affects fire behavior and spread that emerge from events like this. And there were a loss of, and some might say a loss, and here's where I start to get into the maybe a gain in some people's perspectives ecologically, loss of iconic areas and landscapes of Oregon. Here's a patch of high severity fire in the Opal Creek Wilderness, in the Beachy Fire. All those black sticks, that's high severity crown fire that spread through the crowns, burnt the needles. We've got this sort of red piece in the middle, still really intense heat moving through, but it didn't carry through the crowns. It was just on the surface, but that radiant heat transfer killed those needles. And so these are the beginnings of the texture of fire effects that we are seeing across forested landscapes. The same area, but different time of the fire, different topographic context, different time of day. We have this low and mixed severity fire in the Opal Creek Wilderness as well. And this really highlights that there is a mosaic of fire effects and fire severity that's played out from these events. We've also got fire interacting with our aquatic systems. Here's an illustration of high severity fire and low severity fire refugia near to a stream system in that riparian zone. So that just sort of reminds us of some of the big pieces here. If we look at a map of our fire season from 2020, these are the large fires moving on to the from the eastern side of the Cascade Crest to the western side of the crest. And these were really anomalous in terms of where we typically see fire in Oregon. We often see a lot more fire in the southwest, and the east in our historically frequent fire systems. And so this is the real topic of conversation. These are these west side fires that we know have happened in the past, and we're worried about happening more in the future. And we got a real punch of them happening this year as a bit of a wake-up call and a reminder that it's not just that the west side is at risk and vulnerable to fire. I want to highlight that each of these fires, even though I've lumped these into a sort of below the red line and above the red line as distinct sort of families, that each fire has its own context. It has its own historical precedent, its own loss and gain, ecologically and in social terms. And so when we're talking about geography, that's a piece that I really think is important for us to be thinking about in our discussions. When we think about the conditions that really teed up these fires that spread over to our quote, wet side forests, it was this extreme meteorological event of really high winds screaming over from the east side, from east to west, as a function of the tee-up of atmospheric conditions of high and low pressure systems. Can take a look at what this actually sort of played itself out as. I think this reminds us of the power of those winds, the amount of fire we had in Oregon, as well as coming out in California, and that interesting strangeness that played out in the interior where they got snow, and it was that system front that actually contributed to part of the wind system. So now let's get into that. That's a little bit of sort of thinking through what we saw. Number 3, what I wanted to tee us up on in getting us in the right, I guess in what I think is a useful way to talk about the fires this evening. A bit of fire history for context. So here we've got our fire perimeters from this year. Lions Head, Beachy, Holiday Farm are some that are really prominent in people's minds. Underlain in here, in the blacky gray, what I've got are historical fires from the 1800s, early 1900s, back some patterns even coming from the late 1700s. We had about 1 million acres that burned in Oregon across the state for the 2020 season. The Silverton fire up in this area in 1865 burnt 1 million acres on its own as a single fire event. So when we're talking about these fires and trying to wrap our head around where they fit in our social and ecological context now, we need to pull down into this history and recognize that these fires at least some of these fires, the highlights of these fires here, may not actually be unprecedented. In fact, we've got a lot of evidence to show they are not unprecedented. You go back to the Oregonian, we don't have to go through the whole text here. This is text and photo from a colleague, James Johnson, 1857, talking about persons affected were troubled by labored breathing, slight cough, and mucus exportation as a function of the extreme amounts of smoke in the air from fires in the Coast and Cascade ranges. This gives us that historical context. This has been here for a long time. Let's get into some data, some maps based on quantitative metrics. Although Matt Riley, who provided this map to me, another colleague and friend from the US Forest Service, said, think of this map as sort of ish. Turn yourself around 3 times and then open your eyes. And this is kind of a map of what we think our estimated historical fire regimes for the forested areas of the Pacific Northwest actually are. The reds are areas where we know we have infrequent high severity fire. Some of our fires this year were up in that area, but we also have places where historically moderately frequent mixed severity or frequent or even very frequent low severity fires. These are the places we're probably familiar with restoration efforts and ideas about how to sort of modify and collaborate to change fire as a function of fire exclusion in the past over on our dry side forests. They didn't get much fire over on the east side this year. So there's a geography to it. There's pattern in history of how we think these forests have evolved and adapted, and together with lightning strikes and human ignitions as part of indigenous burning and Native American burning have contributed to these historical fire regimes. But for many of our Western Cascades areas and coast forests, these infrequent high severity fires are tricky problems. They're part of the natural rhythm of these systems, and they're tricky, particularly in this social and ecological context that we're in now, with a lot of people living in landscapes where historically we didn't have so much development and population pressure. This is just another conceptual model diagram that gives you an idea of what those different bins of high severity to low severity fire might look like. So high severity fires having large amounts of those stand replacing canopy killing fire events illustrated by red, and these little bluey patches and dark blues that we call fire refugia, places that persist through fire. At the other end, lots of low severity fire and only little patches of high severity fire. And so these mosaics of severity are important elements of the heterogeneity of the expression of fire that we see this year, though with a lot of high severity in those high severity events of Beachy, the Lion's Head, and the Holiday Farm fire. And these are important elements of heterogeneity that contribute to landscape diversity and biodiversity overall. We talk about severity as the amount of biomass consumed. And then when we look for those touchstones, we've used the term legacy to think about the pieces of the puzzle, the pieces of the landscapes that persist through fire and are actually really important in providing the renewal and successional processes that are really important for ecological systems. So when we're thinking about understanding fire's patterning and understanding and unpacking this year's fire patterning, we need to ask one question: how departed are we from historical conditions? And that's a whole kettle of fish in terms of fire ecology to understand where nature's fire rhythms have been disrupted. And I won't go into much more detail here, other than that there is a big question being asked now about our West Side fires of, are we departed from historical ranges of variability? And we don't, and the jury's still out, but we largely do think that these fires that we saw on the northwest end of the Cascades are within the historical range of variability. The second question is, what forest management strategies, regardless of whether we're departed from the historical range of variability, what forest management strategies are effective at minimizing loss of high value resources like trees, but also homes and lives, yet allowing fire to play its important ecological role? So that important ecological role, that's a whole pyrogeography and fire ecology class that I'd love you all to contribute to and participate in. But here's it in a nutshell. Fire is an important ecosystem process. It's a part of biodiversity that we aim to conserve and restore. And it's well recognized that fire plays an integral ecological role in these systems, but with different tempos in different places, as I showed in those maps. Too little fire, too much fire or the wrong kind of fire, and can put ecosystems out of balance. And this is a really nice, I picked this photo for the background here. We've got this wonderful display of bear grass in full show, which is a really, iconic and beautiful fire-adapted species of plant that actually thrives in fiery environments. This is up at Sandium Pass on the PCT trail, the B&B fire. So fire ecology is where we need to be thinking about these pros, these positive elements that come from fire. And some of these high severity fire effects are going to be these fire effects that are positive in their biodiversity value. Now, I just want to finish off here because we've got a lot of other things to talk about. Some thoughts on living with fire. And this, I've stolen this, well, not really stolen, I contributed to it in quite detail, but it's coming out in an upcoming Oregon Stater, which is the OSU alumni magazine, and this piece on living with fire. I want to call out to these folks who designed the layout for that. But where do we go from here in terms of thinking about our pros and cons ecologically with fire, but socially the negatives? There's a bunch of ideas that we can come back to, risk analyses, thinking about how we protect resources and assets and people and health, and where we let wildland fires burn and do their own independent work, addressing inequities. I think Daniel will get a lot into those details, increasing data related to human health costs, expanding our use of prescribed fire, restoration and managed fire and forest management, incentivizing fire-adapted infrastructure to increase community resilience, collaborate, normalize, and work with our neighbors for thinking about living with fire. Because when we put this into a broader context, and Nancy hit on this with her comment about working on the climate change perspective, we know that even though we might not characterize the fires this season as having a primary driver from climate change, we know that there is a drumbeat, a path, a tee-up that is coming with climate change, with higher temperatures and drying out of landscapes within which this whole landscape played out this summer. We had some relatively dry conditions, not unprecedentedly dry conditions, but some pretty droughty conditions that were the sort of the underpinnings of how fire expressed itself this season. So moving forward, living with fire, with climate change, and all of these elements will only make it even more important to think through these pieces. This all fits into a grander scheme that we have nationally for thinking about what's called the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy that talks about maintaining and restoring landscapes, helping fire-adapted communities, and how to keep firefighters safe and do effective fire response. And this is my last slide. I'll just leave it here. And I bet Dan Rayfield will pick up on this one, feeding into what Oregon Governor's Council Wildfire Response is thinking about moving forward for how we live with this balancing act of the ecology, the benefits of fire, and as well as there are ecological costs and social costs too. So I'll stop there. I want to thank many people, and I'll pass things off.
Okay, thank you very much. That was quite interesting. It certainly lays a very nice broad foundation for us to build on. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions for you. So we'll go on to Daniel Lopez Ceballos.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for the invitation. Let me screen share. It'll take a minute, just a second here. So I'm going to build on what my colleague Meg talked about and give a more perspective from a health and specifically a health equity perspective on what we've seen this season, but as Meg pointed out, that is connected to a larger both contemporary historical issue that we face. So a couple of frameworks that I want, topics that I want to touch to help us frame this issue from a health standpoint. One is to be thinking about what this concept of moving upstream from individual level solutions or tackling, say, individual behaviors, from looking at issues like the physical environment, and Meg touched a lot, made some points about that as well, but also thinking about policies and programs. And I know Dan will be speaking more squarely on that aspect. But also I want to spend a little more time here with you and when thinking about or unpacking some of the underlying social inequities that that the consequences of that are impacting populations differently. So that's one lens. The other one that I want to add here to the conversation is an environmental justice or injustice, environmental racism lens to this issue. And the map that you see on the right hand of your screen points out to these effort in the 60s of redlining, and how this is not individual behavior. This is not tied to family decisions, but rather that, as the definition that I offer you here, is a system. So these were policies that were instituted, but in this case, that have long-lasting effects, ripple effects that continue to be. And there's a number of studies that have connected the communities continue to see the effects of that policy in disadvantaging individuals and communities, and so I offer that as another lens through which to come to this issue that brings us today around wildfires. Interestingly and timely, just earlier today, the Lancet Countdown released the most recent report, the 2020 report, connecting the issue of climate and health. I would offer it again as the connection with environmental justice or climate justice, in that we have evidence that connect climate change, increasing the likelihood of wildfire events. In the case of the US, and this is the most recent data released earlier today, we have experienced 1.85 billion more person days of exposure to high wildlife risk compared to the beginning of the 2000s to most recently, so about a 20% increase. The consequences these fires generate dangerous levels of particulate air pollution, both local and long-range health impacts, and I'll mention here a few of those impacts as well, and what continue to contribute to the decline in U.S. air quality seen over the past 4 or 5 years in particular. This is a study that came out last year connecting both the sources of U.S. mortality from particulate matter, this particular metric, the PM 2.5, and connecting that to patterns of consumption in particular. And so you can see that it is two ways in which these air pollution, in this case, is connected to our levels of consumption. And in this study in particular, mentioned or offered these metric, pollution inequity, in that, and what they found is that exposure to PM 2.5 is disproportionately caused by consumption of goods and services, primarily by non-Hispanic whites, but the consumption is overrepresented in that segment of the population, but disproportionately inhaled by African American and Latino communities. So for what they found is that on average, non-Hispanic whites have a pollution advantage. This is to say that they experience about 70% less air pollution exposure compared to their levels of consumption. In contrast, African American and Latinos bear the burden of that pollution, having a 56 and 63% excess exposure relative to their levels of consumption of goods and services. So this is a study offering a little sort of the national picture, but let me bring it to something that we saw and perhaps some of us in this forum tonight experience firsthand. In this case, the Almeda fire down in southern Oregon, impacting particularly the communities of Phoenix and Talon, and certainly it is not a, when we think of wildfires, thinking about particularly perhaps more rural communities, smaller towns, but as you can see in the graph, it's right in the middle of this corridor between Ashland and Medford, and a number of families lost their homes, and they were particularly, because they are sort of in the middle between Medford and Ashland, particularly low-income families that, while living in these more affordable communities, their work was primarily either in Medford or Ashland. So it's sort of in this in-between corridor. Certainly, in other parts of the state, including Southern Oregon, Oregon fires have exacerbated the impacts of that we are seeing already with COVID-19 in low-wage workers, and in this case, particularly farm workers, whose much of their labor is outside. And so this is just a couple of pictures from this one is from California, but this is specifically from Oregon, here in the Mid-Willamette Valley, harvest season. So right around the time that we had the fires, we had the peak of harvest, grapes in particular, and so that those were more exposed, more heavily impacted by the fires. One thing that I wanted to point out, I know that we'll be spoken as part of this forum today around some policies at the state level, but I wanted to bring attention to the larger federal level. And important to, I think, keep in mind, I provide the link there to monitor those, but there are some regulations that the current administration is pushing, finalizing, and including, I mentioned here just two for the sake of time, but that certainly the website, you can monitor others. But at this time, when these communities like farm workers have been more heavily impacted by this double burden of COVID-19 and fires, this rule was finalized to lower wages for immigrant farm workers on temporary work visas. So those visas are very restricted in that workers are tied to their employers, and so that for low-wage workers already, the lowering their wages even further, eroding their ability to face what the consequences may be, the impacts of COVID and wildfires. And the second one, more on the environmental side, excluding environmental health benefits from evaluating regulations on air pollution, and so that harder to justify air pollution limits. And again, just a sample of a couple of these regulations that are happening and are being finalized right now that are, I think, important considerations, as well as what we from the state level we can do. We've heard a lot throughout the season around essential workers, essential sectors. Certainly both African American and Latino, but other racial ethnic minorities. In the case of Oregon, Pacific Islanders, for example, Native Americans, even within Latinos, and overrepresentation, for example, among farm workers of indigenous farm workers. In any case, what this table shows you is that a larger share of, in this case, Black and Latino workers in these deemed essential sectors of the economy. And so these overrepresentation, what leads then is that, and we see the numbers, in terms of overrepresentation on COVID. We have here the cases in Oregon. It is startling that while 13% of the Latino population of the Oregon population is Latino, they make up close to 40% of COVID cases. And it's not a unique trend. We see this trend. I provide here a couple of examples from other states, but increasingly that being the case, and consequently to an overrepresentation in COVID-19 related deaths as well, compared to what their share of their population is. Another concept I wanna share here too is that I think, and I see it was in a conversation just earlier today about the mask use. That important, I think, while individual behaviors are part of this puzzle, that purely focusing on remaining on that level ignores the effect of larger, be it community level policy practices, organizational, institutional issues. Residents in low resource communities, for example, you saw the example of the Almeda fire in Phoenix, Talent. Low socioeconomic position, so socioeconomic status, wealth, the ability to, when thinking about COVID, just to give you an example, the ability to if being overexposed, the ability to come back home, and if testing positive or having been exposed to somebody that tested positive, the ability to have a space where they can quarantine, isolate, quarantine, etc. So those continue to be challenges. And then overall, the institutional patterns of unequal treatment, right at the time we've had, right through this season, we've had COVID, we've had renewed calls for racial justice, and we have fires. And so they are all in, and I offer this, is they all have, if different, coming from different avenues, they have commonalities. There's common patterns in terms of who are the communities more heavily impacted. OSHA certainly is one of aspect that I think is important to continue to working on, and in our case, to continue to push for. OSHA, for example, came out with recommendations around regulations for workplaces, and this is just a picture of a version in Spanish of some of the recommendations for COVID-19 prevention. But are those their many recommendations? Is there a way they become standards, requirements? Can they be enforced? Are they being enforced? There was a study that colleagues from U of O, OSU, and in partnership with colleagues in Washington and California, came out talking directly with farm workers about their precautions. And so certainly they are, there's in their perspective, they are taking more of the precautions and following safety procedures as their workplace allows, as their workplace provides for the protective equipment. A couple more slides here before I pass it on, for addressing these issues, like what we've seen in terms of the human consequences and the disproportionate burden on particular segments of our population, is one, certainly that the income protections, employment protections are important. Certainly, I think what we've seen with COVID and the consequences in terms of the health consequences, the ability to access services without having to worry about do I have coverage, how much of what I'm going to be, the cost is it going to be covered by insurance? It's certainly part of that. Needs to be part of that conversation. Increasing the proportion of representation in the health professions, as well as in other agencies across the the government. It's important. And then lastly, I think one of the things is too that those community-based participatory approaches for research interventions, for partnering with agencies. We're having discussions right now around the rollout of vaccines. So certainly there is the need for working collaboratively with community-based organizations. Lastly, I come back to what I mentioned at the beginning regarding what this larger effort has been over the past few years in terms of public health investments. I think COVID reminds us of this, the wildfires that we have faced this season, and that threats that we'll continue to be facing with climate change, is that we need to prioritize funding to public health infrastructure, critically important, essential for us to be able to tackle these issues. So more resilient public health departments at the local level, at the state levels, as well as the federal response is important. And investments that are crucial to building resilient and more equitable communities. And so more from an equity standpoint, then certainly there'll be more communities that need more of our supports. And so we need to account for that from an equity standpoint. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions later on, and thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much. That was interesting. We've got a lot to think of from what you said. And now we'll move on to Dan Rayfield.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. First off, I went through the participant list, and normally these are in public, and we get to see each other, and there's a whole host of usual suspects and friends. So I just want to say hello, and good to see you, at least by name, in the participant list. And again, thanks for having me. For those that don't know me, again, my name is Dan Rayfield. I'm the state representative of the local area that we're from. My background in the legislature, my current role is the co-chair of the Joint Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee that is responsible for agency budgets, budgetary requests, and things like that. And so my interaction and kind of participation tonight is a little bit about what has the state's response been, as we've gone through this wildfire season, and frankly, some historical context as well as we begin to think about it. So with that said, what I first would probably do is be thinking about, when we talk about this, there is the firefighting, there's the impact to Oregonians, there's the impact to communities, and kind of keeping those in mind. And from a state perspective, we have things like response, you're going to have recovery, and then there's prevention, and kind of that path forward is really kind of the three pots that you'll hear most talked about. The background, I think, is really important this year in terms of how things have transpired. The legislature has, and historically since 2000, the costs of fire in the state of Oregon have continued to rise. The impacts to communities and what it takes to respond to that, and the ability just to fight fire. The severity over at least the last 20-year period is such to where we have not, it has not been easy to retain. We have catastrophic fire insurance in Oregon. And as the insurers who are in the business of a for-profit industry have continued to pay out over a while, you've started to see that go away or modify dramatically. And this obviously puts constraints on our ability to do other services, whether it's K through 12 education or whether it's public health. And so with that context in mind, we came into the 2020 session in February, right? And at this time, we're not, it wasn't really aware in a legislative space that we were going to be experiencing a massive pandemic, or frankly, we had no idea what was in store for us during the summer. In that context, we had started to work on, try to be proactive on passing packages that were responsive to firefighting here in Oregon, prevention, here in Oregon, and it was actually an investment package that unfortunately was unable to get off the ground because the legislative session, unfortunately, a lot of the bills were not passed due to what you may have read about was a walkout in the 2020 session. So there's things primed up, were not able to be passed to be put into implementation. So what you had is this groundwork of work that is being done on the responsive side, also to right the ship within the Oregon Department of Forestry with various funding issues that they were having in terms of making sure they had a stable agency to be able to adequately respond and modernize to fight fires here within Oregon. So that's the context we walk in, and the pandemic hits. And what you start to see in Oregon is our revenue dramatically starts to decline as we start to move into the summer. And we're in a position where we're looking to modify our budgets in a shortfall scenario where we're walking into a 2021 session with pretty significant shortfalls, in excess of, several $billion. These are really large shortfalls and compounded by an absolute need to respond with communities that were disproportionately impacted as a result of the pandemic. We then layer on the wildfires that come in. And that's a really important element because both of those things stack on top of each other in terms of the impact with communities in Oregon on a human level, but also from just a state management standpoint, from our ability just to be able to respond. And just as for a reminder with the state's budget, we do have to balance our state budget in Oregon. We are not in the ability to have tremendous needs in one biennia, overspend, and then recoup that down the road. That's not an option that we get to have in Oregon. And so the combination of, how does the federal government and their funding resources interact on top of the COVID pandemic response that's absolutely needed, which would take a whole nother hour and a half to discuss. And then the wildfires is the situation we found ourselves in the summer, frankly. And we really started focusing again on kind of the response, the recovery, and the prevention. And I want to talk about in a global context, the recovery efforts in Oregon over the next year and a half are expected to exceed over $1 billion. That is in combination with state and federal resources. And note that a lot of these things, there is going to be a partnership between federal resources and state resources. Depending on what happens, some of the mixture of the money, say if it's a split of a 75-25, where 75% is coming from the federal government, 25% in other areas, or from the state resources, that can shift depending on the temperature back in Washington, D.C. So that is a pretty large number. What is that, and what do we start to do? First, you have just the cost to fight the fire, right? And so far, we have been, that is an allocation that, as over time, it's just become a regular expenditure that we've had to plan for, unfortunately, in Oregon, again, which cuts off our ability to do other things. One of the biggest areas, the two biggest areas, are debris and cleanup. And also what we call emergency protective services, kind of health and safety, thinking housing and sheltering and food, if you will. When you think about debris cleanup, that could exceed $600 million in Oregon. And you say, how is that possible? The first phase really was on household hazardous cleanup, right? So the things that we have to work on. So you have DEQ with the EPA, Department of Environmental Quality, where you had about 2,200 properties where we had to get up there and look at debris, hazardous debris cleanup. On top of that, kind of our phase two was really going into hazardous tree removal. all across. You have to go out there and mark the trees, and we're in the process of, contracting with entities to be able to start that work. That work alone is expected, within that 600 million to be about 300 million of the work. On top of that, you have what we call structural cleanup, which would be kind of the ash and kind of the trash that is left behind as a result of forest fires. And again, that is a significant responsibility as we go through this. The other thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about communities, and this is in this response category, is public infrastructure that has been damaged. So thinking about drinking water, sewer systems, and things like that that have been damaged. There are some projects alone for small communities that exceed $85 million. And as you can imagine, even for a city the size of Corvallis, that's a pretty big ticket. But you start thinking about even smaller communities, that becomes, an overwhelming burden that we have to help and revitalize. You have economic development that is something that is being looked at. The other big areas that we have to really address are in the housing side of things. There are right now about 1,100 Oregonians that are being sheltered and fed. 56% of those are currently in Jackson County. And you have, roughly, a little bit more than 4,000 homes that were either destroyed or had significant damage done to them. And so for us, as we think about this, it's kind of a continuum of immediate shelter, moving folks into rental side of things, and then getting back into housing again. And these are significant, partnerships that started off with the Red Cross that will be turned over to the Department of Human Services here shortly. And again, this is an effort just with sheltering and food alone between now and the end of June 2021 that could total around $180 million. And again, these are state and federal match programs. And as we start to walk into a massive budget shortfall, we don't have the luxury to sit back and just balance our budgets. We need to actually be responsive. In times of a pandemic or people are in crisis and wildfire, you don't have that luxury to just march in place and balance things. You need to continue to move forward on communities that have been disproportionately impacted, Oregonians that have lost their homes, folks that are unemployed. So this presents an additional strain on an already strained budget cycle as we enter into the next session. And boy, as I start talking, I didn't anticipate to be this dreary, so I apologize. Normally I have a lot of optimism, and what I can say, at least for the state of Oregon, we are very, very fortunate to live in a state that takes its responsibilities seriously. We have what I would say one of the top 5 states to have historic reserves set aside over the last 10 years for events just like this. And so while it is not going to be easy, I think we feel very fortunate that Oregon is one of the states that is set up best to be able to deal with kind of these two catastrophic impacts to, on the human side, but also on our ability as a state to react. The other thing to be thinking about is school districts. School districts have been hit. And so what you will have seen, some of the funding that, has already gone out the door, you'll see things that schools that have been impacted by wildfire. We've had to allocate, and set aside $20 million for those schools where children are not necessarily in those districts anymore. Safe drinking water was another significant thing. As we look to the future, and the way you normally think about these things is how are we addressing it now when we're not in a legislative session, right? Where we don't have these pots of money lying around or the size of money lying around to be able to make these investments in an immediate sense. We are looking at, how can we potentially go into a special session to put money into the emergency board so we can address these needs in a timely basis. When we get into the upcoming legislative session, we'll be able to be more reactive. We have what I would say a 2-period from the current biennium 19 to 21, which is really now until next June, where we are in the current biennium, that we have a set of expenditures that need to go out the door. And then we have the 21-23 biennia. During that 2-year period, there's another set of expenditures and reactions that we have to work on. Some of the things that are being talked about right now is, how do we utilize our lottery bonds for, continuing housing preservation? How do we use, lottery bonds or general fund to look at safe and healthy homes in terms of manufactured homes? You'd be surprised at the disproportionate share of manufactured homes that have been damaged during the wildfires. We have different special public works programs, again, where communities can apply, so we can get those on board. And then also setting aside money for economic development on an as-needed basis, as we can see, as those proposals come in. Those are some of what I would kind of the response side of things. And then there's a lot of what we talk about is how do we better do this in the future? And there's two separate, and we could probably save the cost side for another conversation, but really there's, forest management practices. This is a very sticky area where politics gets involved in terms of, how do we manage our current forests? There's an environmental perspective, and then there are others who feel, I have a different perspective, and you have to come together in a very difficult and sometimes very emotional, or where people have very strong feelings, to be able to come to agreements on these issues. Some of the packages that we've looked at is, mapping, severity areas, looking at defensible spaces, and how to better handle those where the urban, landscape starts interacting. Smoke mitigation. There's these continual programs where it may seem, when we talk about these things in a forum like this, some of these may seem very like no-brainer ideas that we might be able to accomplish. But in a legislative sphere, when some of these things can be politicized, it becomes a bigger challenge. It was mentioned at one point, there was the governor's council on wildfire. And you might think, boy, there's a governor's council, everybody's on the same page. And that is just not always the case. That's where people come in, and we start trying to figure out, what's best under the circumstances, in terms of balancing those interests, and knowing that people have very strong feelings. The other side of that is, how do we start modernizing the Oregon Department of Forestry in a new landscape? When you talk to folks fighting fire across the state of Oregon, what they will talk about is over the last 20 years, and from their personal experience, and so this isn't necessarily something that's verified in science, but their personal experience is that fires are becoming more difficult to contain upon initial attack, because they believe that there is less moisture, content within the forest. And as a result, fires spread faster and move from there. And so there are modernizing what we would call kind of our severity resources, and reserving in advance our severity resources, where there's increasing competition between states for those severity resources. Oftentimes you might have, an air tanker that is reserved from, different states, and that air tanker might be being used in a different state at that time, and it's used up. And the state of Oregon may not have access to certain resources that it would like. And so there's a lot of moving pieces as we start, heading into this next legislative session. I think the other bit of optimism, that I would, kind of put out there is that there was already momentum to start working on this. This last session, or this last fire season, is just going to, invigorate the desire to continue to move on these things. Sometimes in tragic situations are what is needed to kind of spur, legislative involvement and movement to get significant improvement, as we start to try and make progress on this for the future. Because if we don't, there's going to continue to be significant impacts in terms of the human perspective, but then also from a state, from a budgetary perspective, and our ability to provide other services unrelated to wildfires to Oregonians. And I think that brings us almost to 8, which I think that's when I was supposed to quiet down.
That's perfect. Thanks so much for your contribution. Gives us a lot to think about. So let's start out with a question for Meg. What does all this mean for Corvallis in particular? What's when would you think our fire might be coming? What might it look like? And how can we try to be best prepared to balance the losses and gains?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think in many ways, all 3 of us as panel members have talked a little bit about things that will relate to preparation and how we can move forward from this season to best prepare ourselves, or at least think about what the questions are for adapting in our preparation moving forward for when we do see fire coming from Corvallis. I mean, when we think up to Vineyard Mountain, we think up to the MacDun. You talk to the fire chief, and they're planning. They're thinking proactively about what we do when fire moves through the Corvallis area as a wildland urban interface. We have a lot of fuels. We have homes intermixed with those landscapes. And so thinking about these ideas of defensible space around homes, I think this year was very, I hate to say it, but very helpful for many people to remind them that all parts of Oregon really are susceptible to fire. And so when we think of our home, where we are, what's closest and most beloved to us, if I go so far in terms of thinking about where we live and our families here in Corvallis, to think proactively about what we can do for evacuation, for health and air quality, interior and exterior when we think about smoke, forest management in terms of the context of defensible space and the home ignition zone. But also on that ecological piece, think about, challenge ourselves really to think about what some potential positives of fire could be. And I always, this is a hard piece for me as an ecologist. My ecology and biodiversity brain goes to positives, but this is embedded, as I said, within this really complicated social ecological context. And I don't want to dismiss the suffering and grief and loss that comes with fire. But if we can challenge ourselves to think about the positive elements of preparing ourselves from fire, that may be removing a whole bunch of Douglas fir and getting our oaks back, and then receiving some fire into those oak woodlands. I think those are helpful threads that we need to remind ourselves of as we think about what does fire mean for Corvallis? What is the Willamette Valley fire history? What does the conservation of biodiversity that we as Oregonians, so many of us hold so dear, our natural landscapes? What could the positives of fire be? So I'll leave it at that. That's sort of it's a broad brush painting, but recognizing the inevitability of fire, it's coming. How do we best adapt and prepare from it? What do we learn from this year? And what possible ecological and social values could there be? And there are some. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That addresses one of the questions that somebody had sent in, which was, what in the world can we gain from this fire? Particularly as one that just happened. So you started to address that.
Yeah, well, and if I can just stay on for a few minutes more on that, the positives, because I tried to cover a lot of ground in my little blurb there. There's this feature of succession and ecosystem dynamics that we call early succession. It's the babies, the baby stage of forest development that comes from stand replacing disturbance and opening up the canopy. And our forests are born of fire. Our 700 and 800-year-old trees were born from high severity fire. Our old growth, even at 160, 170, 100-year-old plus trees were born of fire. And so, yes, we have loss, but we also have this gain in ecology, which is an ever-changing dynamic of a system, of the birth of new ecosystems that support a really wonderful assemblage of species, not only plants, butterflies, bees, mushrooms, morels, ungulates. You think of bluebirds and lazuli buntings, species that persist in these open early xeral landscapes. And so those are the positives. Those are my glimmers of hope that come out when I see a high severity matchstick burn. It's not all black. It's, ooh, there's an ecology of hope that's wrapped into that. So again, not wanting to dismiss that we have loss too, but let's find there are some glimmers to really hang our hands onto. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, to start you off, how can the League of Women Voters support efforts at the community and policy levels to tackle the disproportionate burden of wildfires among Latinx and other underserved communities?
Thank you, Nancy. I think I building off of Meg was touching. I think one of the things that I think for ourselves when we had to hunker down even more so because of the poor air quality for a number of days, right? And I think the housing conditions in our local community I think vary widely, and certain even would say stay at home, stay inside, but if the windows had they wouldn't be a real barrier, right, for that ash that would come in, that then would trigger from allergies, asthma reactions, etc. So there are, I think, very locally, I think we have to engage more into improving housing conditions, particularly for our lower income families, our renter community, right? The quality of the rental housing, I think it is a real issue, so that we are better prepared for next time. That also extends for our homeless population, right? And then I think more broadly in terms of the supports, and Representative Rayfield touched on this about the over 1,000 families that continue to be dislocated, right? As a consequence of the fire. Many of those families are mixed status. Some, they have undocumented family members. They may not be able to follow the regular channels to claim support, to file claims, to get the support. And so how can we go about providing alternatives for that through this season, including fires, but COVID relief as well? For example, the PECUN, the Farm Worker Union, along with other organizations, have established an Oregon Worker Relief Fund, so that workers and their families, regardless of documentation status, would have an ability to access funds, right? And I think the last thing I would say is to building upon already existing spaces like regional health equity coalitions, and that don't cover all of the state, but they do cover. There's a Lynn Benton Health Equity Alliance, for example, and so that we can build upon those organizations to better serve those communities, to building from that work and that trust that organizations like the Health Equity Alliance hold with the communities, to visualizing those communities, right? I always think about, the example in Newport when there was an outbreak in a seafood. And as a consequence of that, the larger community realized not only that there was a Latino immigrant community there working in that industry, but also an indigenous speaking, a Hmong speaking community that wasn't as visible before, but as a consequence of the outbreak, and so that became more widely visible. So I think that it's important to action to work in this partnership model with organizations that have the trust of these communities more heavily impacted to address and tackle these issues that are going to continue to be, we're going to continue to be being exposed and facing these challenges moving forward.
Thank you. Really good ideas. Appreciate that. Dan, could you talk a bit more about the dynamics this year? What is the state's role as regards to wildfire now, especially given the response in relation to the pandemic? We've gotten several questions also about the kicker and whether there's any possibility of erasing that in relationship to this.
I think that's a great question. So I think one of the things that we should be thinking about as a state, as communities, how do we pay for fire in the state of Oregon? And what is our responsibility between landowners and just our state taxpayer dollars as we think about this? This has been a historically significant and important conversation that continues to go on year in and year out through the legislature. It only continues to gain more traction, right, when we start to see these significant expenditures year over year into wildfire and how that impacts our ability to provide essential services to Oregonians. And historically, up until about 1965, the landowners paid the entire cost of forest fire. And the cost of the management and the fire protection on their land, I should say. Following 1965, that's where we got into this partnership agreement where, over time, in theory, landowners pay roughly about 50% and the state pays about 50%. The way that is calculated is often a significant debate about whether it is right now currently truly at a 50-50. When we get into significant large wildfire fire costs, the state share continues to increase in excess of 50%. But these are very challenging conversations to have in a state that is, historically, relied upon its landowners, the timber industry, right? And you think about the impacts of these tax revenues on those, what I would say, from economically a very historically significant industry for this state. Over time, there's been changing perspectives, right, among different, political philosophies about the importance, and how these, how our forests should be managed and harvested. And that is another political layer that complicates, these conversations. But actively right now, that's something that people are looking at, working on. There are other, conversations with respect to how is the Oregon Department of Forestry managed. And that is a really significant conversation as we move forward. We have something called the harvest tax, which is renewed every 2 years. And it pays for a portion of the Oregon Department of Forestry's budget. To pass a tax in Oregon, if we were in public, we could be having a fun conversation. But for the, we get, so I'm sure Peggy Lynch, and I saw her put a question in there, she would yell out the answer to this. But, to pass a tax in Oregon, we have to have a 3/5 majority to be able to do that. The harvest tax is something that funds a significant portion of the Oregon Department of Forestry's budget, and we have to repass that every 2 years. In doing so, it creates a pressure point where industry can try and round up the votes, and whether they may not like a policy, right, or they may not like the way the Department of Forestry budget looks, right, that creates this pressure point where votes can be locked down because you need such a higher threshold. And in the past, certain bills have been killed politically as a result of the, this 2-year harvest tax with a high threshold before the votes were released, if you will, to be able to vote for policy. It is a strange leverage point in the state's budget as well that complicates what I would say the management of, kind of our, our forests, our ecosystem, the agency, and a long-term perspective. And so those are these big kind of issues and that are in the background. They're very wonky. You're not going to hear them being talked about in the hallways. In fact, nobody's in the hallways right now. Where you won't hear it being talked over Zoom in the chat, I guess, if you will. It is for the wonky, nerds of the legislature that dabble in these areas. These are important things, right? We want to be able to create budgets without influence from industry. We want to pass policy that is good policy, that is not being artificially influenced by any side, right? We want to have good policy. And there's these pressure points and there's been interesting articles, over time that have come out on these things. With respect to the kicker, that's a kicker is something that is, constitutionally, it is in our government. What we need to do at this point for folks that would like to reform the kicker, and it is a very strange mechanism, and that's a polite way of putting it, where in good times, it doesn't allow us the ability to really save for times when we might need for the times where we don't have resources, we're in an economic downturn. And because it returns these unspent or over-projected dollars back to taxpayers. There are many people who have been interested in finding modifications to that. The big issue is that this would need to go to the voters. And I think that is the prevailing thought. Lately, there has not been the momentum in the legislature to be able to overturn the voters' support for the kicker in the past. And so that's why we continue to live with that mechanism. We did modify the corporate kicker, voters did. And so that is something just to keep in mind, where that corporate kicker goes back into the state for education, as you're thinking about that. And so it is, it is not really a mechanism that we're currently thinking about and how to, address, the costs of fire.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question that kind of goes across health and ecology about prescribed burns. How do we balance the need for prescribed burns with the health impact of particulates? How much is too much? How much is too little?
I'll take a first stab at that one, because it's a really interesting question, and actually involved in a working group focused on our dry sort of east side forest, thinking about that prescribed fire component in the context of social justice and health equity. How do you optimize restoration benefits for bringing prescribed fire into these historically frequent fire systems, yet also recognize how to prioritize where that happens to minimize health effects of smoke? And so this is a spatial exercise that we haven't completed the analysis yet to try and sort of figure out what the major levers on that would be. But I think it's a really important component. The other part of thinking through that question is trying to really quantify whether the prescribed fire smoke that we're releasing into the atmosphere under those sort of better, sort of more sort of lifting conditions, those blue sky conditions, whether those are sufficiently sort of good enough in contrast to the smoke that you would receive from wildfire. So as folks in my group like to say, how do you want your smoke? Do you want your smoke from a severe, extreme, long-term wildfire, perhaps socked in for multiple weeks, or do you want prescribed burning as a sort of a more episodic piece under good atmospheric lifting conditions to try and ameliorate the probability of a higher severity fire down the road? And so that's a really interesting puzzle that people are trying to work through, of how do you want your smoke, and how does the wildfire smoke play up against the prescribed fire smoke? And the hardest ones are those seasons where we have wildfire, and then on the shoulders we want to do prescribed burning, and people say, I've had enough. And from a health perspective, they've had enough. And we don't have the refuge that we need in our homes, in the way we build our homes, in our air filtration systems, in how we've designed communities to allow for that to happen and to provide that refuge. That's something we all need to work on as we work to recognizing we need more prescribed fire, and we are going to have more wildfire, and those are just going to keep on working together.
Mhm.
So a little context, no clear answer, but a little bit of
Yeah, no,
maybe
that's very helpful.
some meat on it. Yeah.
Daniel, do you have anything to add on that?
I'd say that, along the lines, I think it's something that mentioned before, is that goes hand in hand, is what is the protections, particularly for more vulnerable segments of our populations, more, that would be more sensitive and have develop more serious health consequences for that, right? I think it is about working hand in hand with those communities, with those families being impacted, and also with an equity criteria as of what are the resources that those families would need, getting homes up to code so that they are able to, when those particularly the more managed, right, the fires, that then we are making sure that those families have the protections needed to withstand those consequences.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, and outdoor workers as well, whether they're farm workers or
Right.
anyone working outdoors, there's just nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide.
Mhm, mhm,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
mhm.
Well, we had one question that ties in with this. Why not require fire-resistant construction for replacement homes? It's expensive, but it would be a good investment to mitigate higher costs.
Yeah.
I think that's it touches on actually a very interesting topic that I only have dabbled around, and there's a lot much smarter people in the legislature working on some of these topics. But you want to think about is the homes that have burnt down were a mosaic, in terms of when they were built, the type of structures that they were, where they were located, and over the years, how our land use laws have changed. What do you allow, in terms of insurance, reimbursement and things like that? What do you rebuild to? Do you rebuild the current code when folks don't have the resources? Do we have the ample resources to kind of meet that difference, which is what we're really looking towards? And so it's very fascinating conversations, frankly, around all of those, where you may, the setbacks, from rivers or different things like that. It's very. I find it very interesting. I'm obviously in a budgetary world, so I don't always get to be involved as much as I'd like until those concepts are a little bit more developed, and those thoughts are more developed, but very fascinating. The other thoughts that people, and this is really went back to some of the work that was being done in the 2020 session on, defensible spaces, and on those, kind of, urban interfaces, and how do we, as a society, what type of, measures do we take? And what I can say is that for every one positive person, you have counterpoints on the other side, which can make some of these conversations very difficult.
Right. Another question, how are forest management practices changing in light of these climate crises, and particularly wildfire? So several questions about forest management practices in relation to water retention, for example, the burns.
I could very kind of quickly address that, and this is a pretty big topic area, but just to say that this had been a conversation for years with, how do we modernize, our Forest Practices Act. There was an agreement that was reached recently, and if for those that are truly interested, it was something that the governor's office had worked, who brought kind of environmental folks together along with kind of the timber industry and other interested parties, and kind of was able to craft a deal that had long eluded the legislature, and you can go, and we actually had to fund some of that work recently, and so you can go and take a peek, I think, in some Oregonian articles about how specifically the nuances of that. Since that happened, that has not, it's in the legislature, it's kind of, you get this long, coveted change, frankly, for a lot of folks, and there hasn't been as much momentum at the moment for making new modifications to the current system, as the landscape is still kind of settling, if you will.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of pipe in a little epithet there of, I think we often talk about forest management as this sort of monolith, and going to the Oregon Forest Practices Act is a logical place to go. But when we think about ownership and mandates and goals of so many different landowners across Oregon, when we think about what is forest management, there is a whole bunch in there. It's got a geography to it, and we've got a biogeography and a pyrogeography that underlies it. Public-private lands is the initial division there. That I think we need to really think in a nuanced way and dig deep into what we mean when we ask questions about what kind of forest management we can do and where, to help us learn to live with fire and to help us work through adaptation to climate change. So just I don't want to unpack that conversation of what do you mean by forest management, but just recognizing that, whoa, that's a big beast that we often lump into one little, well, actually it's two words, management, forest management. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. Daniel, another question about farm workers and what protections are there, what protections should there be for farm workers in relation to fire and other things like COVID as well?
Mm-hmm. So certainly there are OSHA guidelines. Organizations that you mentioned, PECUN, for example, right? The union and the protections that come from unionized labor versus non-unionized labor. In my own research, I've seen differences in access to healthcare services and health outcomes if the farm workers are employed directly by the employer versus being employed through a labor contractor. And so that sort of erodes the protections as well that workers may have. We have drivers' cards, important for workers and their families to mobilize it, but it took a lot of effort. It'll come into effect at the beginning of next year. We do have in Oregon, and like in other states, we have for access to healthcare services for all women, regardless of documentation status, and access to health insurance for all children, regardless of documentation status. However, we don't have the same protections for workers. So I think one of the areas that we could expand or build upon these other legislative administrative efforts is to expand healthcare coverage to workers. It is true both in Oregon and nationwide that Latinos overall have lower rates of health insurance, and when we think of farm worker populations, even less so. So that when these issues like the pandemic, like wildfires occur, the protections are minimal. So there's a number, I think, of efforts that both in terms of enforcing and making sure that the measures that OSHA guidelines are followed, working with employers, right, to fill gaps into what they are or not able to provide, so that we have those protections in place, and also working with organizations like the Farm Worker Union, PECUN, but others that would also help both in terms of the support systems, but also to moving changes to policy like pesticide exposure, for example. That's a whole nother big area, but that's certainly prevalent in our state as well as in other states.
Right. Thank you. It's hard to get into all the aspects of all of these questions. We had a rather specific question about asking about more specifics on funding wildfire fuel reduction and removal, and whether there's any revenue from timber commercial products that can offset the cost of wildfire protection.
I'm just reading the question. That was a lot.
Yeah.
I'll say from a state perspective, there's, I get involved on the back end of some of these things, and so this is probably not a question I would probably be out over my skis if I started to answer that a little bit. What I can say is, I mean, there was. When we looked at, what I would say kind of like fuel reduction, different kind of on the prevention side of things, there was a package in the 2020 session where we were looking at doing that. And it was a heavily negotiated package where folks on one side feel very comfortable, with doing fuel reduction, in partnership, on different forest lands. There are others who, a big part of that conversation were the sideboards that you put in place to make sure that it's done in a responsible manner. And so there is. These things are, while we can talk about them in conversations like these, when we really start, putting them down on paper, and you have 90 legislators and a governor, and those people are being advised, by, whether, folks that they trust, whether they are within industry, environmental advocates, because you have to remember legislators, like myself, I'm an attorney. I came to the legislature without knowledge, frankly, of, that a lot of the fellow panelists here have. And, part of our job is to take in this information and learn to make the best decision you can under those circumstances. And so when you have that entire dynamic, people do, they start to go into different camps and form, various opinions. And so it's still a moving target. I think that will continue to be addressed, when as we head into this next session, but it's not, again, it's not something that you would consider necessarily a slam dunk, and there definitely will be sideboards put on that fuel reduction.
Anybody else want to add anything?
I'll keep it short. Other than there's so much that goes into that word. I'm a taxonomist at heart. I like to make trees out of everything. There's so much that goes into that word, fuel treatment and fuel reduction. And so I think that's also an important part for us all to be thinking about is a fuel reduction treatment on east side forests might be small, spindly trees. That's taking out the understory and ladder fuels that would be carrying fire up into the canopies in a way that we're concerned about, and that would have a different economic sort of break point to it and portfolio to something maybe on the west side where actually fuel reduction might have to be clearing large fuel breaks of a landscape to remove fuels altogether. And so those are all lumped under the term fuel treatment, but in different geographies and different places, they can be different things with different economic portfolios, different ecological consequences, and different actual sort of values in actually mitigating any fire risk whatsoever. And what we're very worried about in some of our west side forests is taking out some of the trees in a quote unquote thinning environment. And we know that the canopy of trees provides a really beautiful microclimate that actually maintains moisture in some of our west side fires. And if we start to thin out too much, maybe we break that up and we dry out the system. We've taken some fuel out, but we actually dried up the system too. And maybe that's not the win-win that we wanted. We've actually exacerbated the problem. So there's a tricky bit there in terms of thinking about the whole system and the economics of that quote unquote that one term again, fuel treatment or fuels reduction. So
and Daniel, are there minorities that work, particularly Latinx people working particularly with fuel reduction and forestry work? Do you have that?
I know of crews as well, right? There that are working in those jobs as well. I don't know how. I'm not as familiar as to as in say in farm work that they are overrepresented right in that segment, but I know certainly that they are involved as well.
I imagine there's a relationship. Well, we'll do just one last question. And this is, what about the rainy day fund? It's raining. When are we going to use it?
I can answer that as one of 90 people in the legislature and give my personal opinion on it. The governor released what we call her governor's recommended budget, which is the way I would read that as more of like a vision statement of where she wants to emphasize investments. It is not, there are things and fictions that are in budgets like that to make the numbers square up. And there's realities, for instance, we're probably have several $100 billion of testing for COVID money that isn't even accounted for in that budget, which would obviously put things out of kilter, or various things in there that may not be politically possible, that, reduction options that where the budget doesn't necessarily square up. And so I think it's a great vision statement and a direction on how she wants to handle the pandemic and wildfire response. There's some, serious shortcomings within that budget as well, from just on a personal level. But even in that budget, the governor used about $200 million of our reserve funds. There's two reserve funds in Oregon. We want to think of the Education Stability Fund, and then we have our Rainy Day Fund. One is constitutional, the other is, and my son is coming to the room right now with me. For sure.
Thanks, Newman.
Oh, bonjour. He said bonjour. He's French.
Snack.
He's brought some snacks for us.
Very
Okay, hold on one sec. We do have a code word in our family that I say, and then he knows that he's overstayed his welcome on a Zoom meeting, but I won't say it right now. So with that, getting back to kind of the rainy day fund itself, the governor used about $200 million of our reserve funds. We have roughly estimated to be, give or take around $1.2 billion that we will have. I do not believe, given the context and the environment that we're operating in, that we are not going to use more than that. That's a personal opinion. Of course, there are going to be people who disagree with me. I agree with Peggy Lynch, who asked the question that it is raining, and frankly, especially when we're in an economic recovery situation, we're in a pandemic where we have communities that have been disproportionately impacted, an economy that and even when we look at our revenue forecast, really shows how broken our economy is, and how it is. We are the folks that are succeeding or continue to succeed, and the folks that are being impacted the most, are whether it's BIPOC communities, whether it is more vulnerable Oregonians. I think that we have a duty and obligation to use those funds and not make a recession any worse than it already is. We must mitigate the impacts of recession before. That's just a personal opinion of mine. I believe we're facing about potentially a 3-year recovery period where we have to do everything we can, from on the public health side, Oregon Health Plan, within self-sufficiency, all the way into higher education. Right, we have some really significant responsibilities, but that presents some pretty significant opportunities too, which is where I think the excitement is. So yes. I should have just said yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. This has been a very rich panel, and there's so much more we could talk about. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Corvallis Sustainability Coalition, the League of Women Voters Oregon, and UCAN Corvallis. And there'll be a list of resources that panelists have recommended that will be on the League of Women Voters Corvallis website, along with the YouTube version that's been recorded of this, if you would like to share it. So it's great to have you all here. Thanks so much. Take care and stay well. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.